Welcome to Chapter 15, Positioning, Floating, and Flexbox. This is actually a very fun chapter, although a very short chapter. For this first video, we're talking specifically about positioning. Now, positioning itself deals with the placement of an element on a web page. The good thing is, using positioning, you can pretty much move the element wherever you want, whether it's the far right, whether it's the bottom, or even somewhere in the middle to make it, well, wherever you want. So let's go over exactly what we're dealing with here. One other item with positioning is that you can also determine the exact layout of the layers you're going to have. So if you have multiple items, you can determine exactly how they will be laid out and what items can actually be first. Let's start off with the most basic element, position relative. Position is the property, relative is the value. This relative position moves the element based on its relative or current loading location. So based on wherever you have the element loaded, you can actually move it based on the fact you're using the relative position to move it. By itself, the element keeps the occupied space, and some additional properties are top, bottom, left, and right. I would recommend using a decimal value here because percentage values don't really work well. You can use them, but I recommend using a decimal value such as pixels, points, or something along that line. So let's take a look at exactly what this can do. So let's take position relative. Well, by itself, it doesn't do anything. So we actually need to add the secondary property of top, left, right, or bottom, and then give it a value for the element to move. So if we say top negative 20 pixels, that means that the element is going to move up 20 pixels. Basically, the top area is pulling it by 20 pixels. If we say top 20, not the negative, then it's going to be pushed down 20 pixels. Basically, we're pushing the item down from the top of the page 20 pixels. If we say left negative 20, then again, that is moving it to the left. The left is decreasing the space by 20 pixels. On the opposite, if we say left 20, it moves it to the right 20 pixels, as in it is moving or adding 20 pixels of space between the left part of the element and the actual element itself. We can also say right negative 20 pixels, which will do the exact same thing, because the right is decreasing the space between the right side and the element itself. So therefore it is decreasing by 20 pixels. Let's reset what we have and add a bit of text right here, because once you make things relatively positioned, you're also dealing with a layering concept. So if you say position relative top 50 pixels, you notice the element actually goes over the text. That's because the text is not relatively positioned or positioned at all. It is just positioned based on the loading aspect of the page, and the element that it has a relative position is being pushed over it due to a layering effect. There is a way to get around this. We'll get to that in just a minute. When it comes to stacking order, you can use this in combination with position by using the z-index, that's two words separated by a dash. You can determine the placement of an element like a layer. If you've ever used Photoshop or another photo editing software, then hopefully you have a good idea about what layers are and how you can actually determine what the order of the layers are so that you can get the effects that you want. For web pages, it is the exact same thing, but in order to use the z-index, you have to use it in combination with position, whether it's position relative or another one we'll talk about later. The usage is just z-index and then a value. It is a unmetered value, basically meaning that it doesn't need any kind of unit, so ununited I should say, as long as you have a number. The value can be any numerical number, such as negative infinity to infinity, but it's best to use multiples of 10 or 100 so you can easily manage the values. Without z-index specifications, elements load on top of each other based on their code placement. So for example, the h1 loads first, then the p tags, then the image. Those load in that order. So let's take, for example, this very easy example of a yellow, green, and a blue box. By just loading them by themselves, they load, well, as they should, one on top of the other. Once you start messing with the actual positioning of it, such as top and left, you'll see that the different elements layer on top of each other because that's how they're loaded in the actual page. Once we add the blue box, we see that they're all layered on top of each other. However, once we specify the yellow box to have the blue box to have a z-index of -100, that pushes the blue box to the back of the page because the other elements have by default a z-index of 0. If we add the yellow box to have a z-index of 100 versus -100, that pulls the yellow box to the front, so that way we can actually see what's on that element, and the others are pushed behind. Let's talk about position absolute. This is relatively close to the relative positioning, but instead of being positioned where the element is, it's based on the top left of the browser. Now, basically what that means is that if you set anything from the top or the left position of digital media, it is going to be based on the top left corner. If you have any experience working with games or consoles, then you may notice that when you boot up your PS4, when it tries to coordinate how big the screen is, it's based on the top left positioning of your digital media format. The same goes for VCRs, Blu-ray players, monitors, laptops, mobile phones, etc. All digital media is based on the top left corner, and position absolute does that exact thing. You are positioning it from the top left of the browser corner. You can use the top, bottom, left, right items as well, and you can use decimal and percentage values, but again, percentage values are based on the browser. So if you say top 50% and left 50%, that means it's going to be 50% of the height and 50% of the width based on the browser specifications. As soon as you resize a browser, those percentages will stay, but the position of the element will decrease because it's only 50% of the available space. So by itself, the element does not keep its occupied space because it's technically being pulled out of the flow of the actual document. So if you have an element such as an image and you say position absolute, then whatever space that image was supposed to take up is now vacant for anything else to fill up because you are taking it out of the normal flow of the document. So for example, if we say position absolute, top 100 pixels, that means it's going to go from the top of the page and push it down 100 pixels. Not wherever the element's loaded, it's going to start from the top left of the browser. Let's take a look. So we have our nice element again, just right there. And again, like I said before, we're basing it on the top left corner of the browser. So if we say just an element right here that's loaded and it has some text around it, this is actually using a float element that we'll get to in the next video. But this is kind of your stereotypical layout of what you want it to look like. If we say position absolute top 0 and left 0, then it's going to position the element at the top left corner of the page. Keep in mind that once you do this and it's taken out of the normal flow of the page, it is placed on top of the other elements because you are positioning this and overriding the default styles. If you say top 0 left 100%, that means that there is 100% of the browser space between the left corner and, well, the other side of the page, in this case the right side. But that also means that your element is pushed off the page because you have 100% of the browser space between the left side and the element, which basically means you're pushing it off. So instead, you can say left to 90%, and you can have the element shown on the page. How do you get it on the far right side? Well, you can use the right element instead of the left. Let's take a look at bottom. If you say bottom 0 and left 90%, then it's going to place it on the bottom of the page, not just the bottom of the browser, because the bottom of the browser could be anything, especially if the content of the page does not extend to the length of the browser height. So therefore, it'll be placed at the bottom of the browser, but if you have more content, it'll be placed at the bottom of the page. If you say bottom 0 and right 90%, then 90% of the browser's width will be placed between the element and the right side of the page. And lastly, if you just say bottom 0, right 0, it places it at the bottom right corner of the page. Nice and easy. However, if you say position relative and bottom right 0, 0, that means that it's going to put it back in the normal flow of the page, and because you're not pushing it left, right, bottom, or top, then that means that it's going to be placed exactly where it's supposed to be, and the text is going to display after it. We'll get to floating in just a minute. So let's combine the absolute and relative, because you can do both, but not in the same element. One has to overwrite the other. So let's take this nice example of this blue box and this yellow box. The yellow box we'll start with first. The position is relative and right and top is 50 pixels and 50 pixels. Basically, it's pushing the yellow box 50 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the right of the actual spacing of the element. So based on that, it's pushing it down and pushing it left 50 pixels each. If we say with the blue box, position absolute and right and bottom of 0, then it's going to take the blue box and put it in the bottom right corner, but it's still going to keep the yellow box exactly where it is, because that's where we positioned it relative to the actual loading of the element, because it's inside a parent element. Other positioning options are sticky, fixed, and static that are beyond the scope of this course, and we're not going to cover those, but if you want to, you can certainly research them on your own. Now, when you're talking about bypass links, one thing you can do is you can actually use this same concept and make the bypass link basically disappear from the page. It's still there in the content, but as far as a visual aspect of the page, you can make it disappear from the visual portion of it, so that people that don't need to see it don't need to see it. So by doing that, you can use the bypass link of identifying whatever your bypass is, saying position absolute, and then you can say top negative 9999px. Basically what that means is that the bypass link jumps off the page and the rest of the content moves up where it's supposed to go. Now the other thing is, if someone does need to get to that bypass link, because in text-based browsers you don't have CSS, so CSS doesn't really matter, you can also use bypass focus, making it so that if someone does need to access it by either pressing the tab key or by some other assistive method, you can actually move it back into place by just saying top and left of 10 pixels each. That means that as soon as someone presses the tab key and they give the link actual focus, because the link is still in the content, it's just not visible, then that's going to automatically reappear on the page. It will appear over the content because you are positioning it, but it is available to access once you press the tab key. Once you go away from it, either by clicking or by pressing tab, then the bypass link will disappear once more. That is it for this first video of Chapter 15. If you have any questions about this or anything in Chapter 15, please send me an email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll get back to you with the best possible answer. In the next video, we're talking about floating in columns.